to food. So yeah, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks. I guess the mention of food just made a lot of people leave, which was sad. I guess they were hungry. That's okay. I'm kind of terrified. I don't know if you guys have noticed this if you're not speaking, but like there's the voice of God thing happening with the reverb up here. So it's really kind of freaking me out, but that's right. I prefer no microphone, but so it goes. Yeah, so I am really happy to be here because bizarrely Interactivos basically decided what I did with the last 6 years of my life, and I didn't know that was going to happen. So thanks, or it's your fault. I don't know. So it's this is a good chance to revisit that because the rough idea that I brought to the Interactivos I participated in 2010 was really rough. It got formed, and then we just went and did stuff for 6 years and haven't really thought about it. So I'm going to show just a rough assembly of some of the things we've been up to. And then what I thought we could do maybe, because people are probably sleepy at the end of the day, is we could stop for questions like as we go, like a third of the way through, because then people will be awake, because their voice will be heard and it won't just be mine. So I also have a bunch of books for you guys after that I'll leave, because I don't get to be here for 2 weeks and join you, which will be wonderful. Oh man, sorry for the translator. This is going to be tough. I'll try to slow down. Okay, so there's a Twitter handle in case you want to use it throughout the presentation. There's these crazy yellow explosions that are really ugly. Kat and Emma, the two people I work with, didn't get to approve these slides, so I could do whatever I wanted. They're hideous. They're hashtags, and I'm really happy kind of to go after Urs and Chris, because in some ways I think our practice might sit between those two spaces. That's what the sense I was getting. I think we're quite interested in this sort of rough and ready hack and workshop phenomena, but also processing things enough that they're meaningful and have affect for people who aren't willing to come in and spend the day in the hack space. So I think we're kind of quite interested in tacking between that sort of hands-on experiential learning, as well as then digesting things enough so that they can be approached by a wide audience. Okay. So yeah, we run a thing called the Center for Genomic Gastronomy, which now we say examines the biotechnologies and biodiversity of human food systems. Before I met Kat at Interactivos, I was a professor in Bangalore, India at the Srishti School of Art and Design. I was working with Yasha Shetty on an experimental media arts graduate program. And these were some of the undergraduate students who we were taking around to some of the markets, which you'll hear more about later. And Kat, Katrina Kramer, who's Norwegian, was finishing up her graduate thesis, which involved trying to make it snow strawberry ice cream, which I thought was amazing. So we each applied with different projects to Interactivos and Gijón. This is just a photograph of some of the different project leaders and participants. So definitely have fun. Don't stay in here the whole 12 days. I would highly recommend you leave. And I was talking at lunch today, someone asked what my recommendation for some of the groups were. And I suggest you take an early prototype, like 4 or 5 days in, and go somewhere that's not here and interact with people not in this space. I think it's important to get out and make sure stuff leaves the lab. So we did some of that. This was an early little color meal we did on these public sculptures in Gijón. And this was actually the final installation of the Interactivos, where we kind of pulled stuff together. So a lot of these works actually still exist and are really important to our thinking. Okay, yeah, so there's been a lot of talk about collaborations today. So basically, I'll tell you a bit about our work and some of the people we collaborate with. Since we started in 2010, we've worked primarily Europe and Asia and a little bit North America, and we've done publications. We do objects and exhibitions, labs and workshops, and recipes and meals. And so the lab space you there see is biophilia, which I saw in the last. You'll see a lot of the same like lab spaces, which is kind of hilarious. So these are kind of some of the modes that we work in. Some of our long-term collaborations are with Emma Connolly, who joined the group full-time 3 years ago, Nicola Twilley, who's a journalist and food writer there, Heather Julius, who's a chef. And then we also work with hackers, chefs, farmers, scientists, of course. So Denise Akera, Yasha Shetty, Oren Katz, Wendy Russell, Mark Dussier. I just found this photo from Prague, so I thought it'd be good. You're always hiding in photos, I noticed, Mark. I'm not sure what that says. So I think what we're really keen on is pulling these people who otherwise don't talk to each other in a bizarre mix so they do talk to each other. And so in the early days, that was getting computer hackers talking to foodies. And what that meant is that when you go to hacker conferences, and we've spoken at a lot of them, CCCC in Berlin and the Dutch Hacker Camp and the New York Hackers on Planet Earth, the food is generally terrible. And when you go to foodie things, there's especially like elite foodie things, they're pretty resistant to new technologies, especially digital technologies and biotechnologies invading their space. But there's a shared political aim of open source and making things legible to people who want to participate in them. So we do try to bring those two communities together, and it sometimes causes road bumps. Yeah, but we'll see some more of those. So just a couple of quick definitions. So we called ourselves the Center for Genomic Gastronomy. When actually I applied to Interactivos, my project was called Franken Food Cart. And I just was like, I want to cook with GMOs. There it is. So that was kind of where it started. And I got some good encouragement from a mentor. So maybe your mentors have some of this advice. One of the mentors said, actually, it seems like you're interested in a much larger conversation about food and the life sciences and then food and ecology, and that's true. And so the name got changed to the Center for Genomic Gastronomy. So genomics enables scientists to study genetic variability and interactions between all of an organism's genes and the environment. So that's a mouthful, but we can just use life sciences as a shorthand. And gastronomy is the art of eating food. So we've come to understand the Center for Genomic Gastronomy as a study of organisms and environments that are manipulated by human food cultures. And so you'll see this "We Have Always Been Biohackers" poster out there, I guess. Yeah. And in this photograph, and what we mean by that is we try to never use the word nature. It's a huge problematic word in Western philosophy, but it's even more close to home. It's interesting talking to some of our peers who are food activists who say, I want only natural food. And we say, well, we don't like natural, so tell us more about what kind of food you want. Because I think what sometimes people mean is wild or pre-agricultural. Sometimes what people mean, they mean lots of things, so we just don't use it. And instead what we do is we lay out the wide color palette of some of the genomes that we've been hacking the hell out of for 10,000 years. So with the advent of agriculture, we've started selective breeding and doing other things to plants, animals, fungi, et cetera, and increasing shaping those organisms to do stuff that we want them to do, or that we think we want them to do. And so we are interested in having that conversation with people and helping them unpack some of their own desires, so either their own political critiques or their own food designs can be more articulate. But sometimes it doesn't always stick, and people just leave disgusted. We've only had 2 people walk out and 3 people throw up. And the 3 people who threw up, it wasn't from our food. So that was good. One of them was hungover. In the US, you might know there's no cultural funding, and so the only time we got funding in the United States was from some nonprofit, and we had to write a mission statement. So our mission statement is to map food controversies, prototype alternative culinary futures, and imagine a more just, biodiverse, and beautiful food system. And that last part's really important because beauty confuses the scientist and it confuses the artist. So we're really happy, right? You're not supposed to talk about beauty as an artist in the 21st century. And certainly scientists, when we say, well, what's the beautiful part of your work? How are you adding beauty to the world? Look at us with like totally blank faces. But it's actually a really key insight that we had at the first Interactivos, that taste does matter. And by taste, we mean both flavor and preferences. And that probably as a human right, everyone has a right to have tastes and values that can be articulated. So even the most food insecure person, someone who's starving, can say, I don't want to eat that. It is against my religion, against my beliefs. Like that would actually be a great thing to head towards. And so it starts to make people use language that they're unaccustomed to across the board from many disciplines. So beauty is really key to what we think about and talk about. Okay, let me do a couple more slides and then I guess we'll do some questions. So biodiversity and biotechnology. Those are kind of the 2 things we're looking at. And they're not opposites in any way. They're just sort of intersecting. One of the things has anyone heard of molecular gastronomy? Have people heard of that? Some people, not so many. Okay, so maybe I'll just do a quick definition. Basically, towards the end of the 1980s, 1990s, people started manipulating food and breaking it down to its chemical constituents and then building it back up to tell really amazing stories with food or to do unusual unexpected things with it. A lot of this food was highly abstracted, and it didn't look like the organisms or ingredients that it stemmed from. And farm to plate, more recently, a lot of the most popular restaurants have moved away from this chemical way of thinking and have started to think more about how they source their food. Some of the molecular gastronomy people you might have heard of, Heston Blumenthal, El Bulli restaurants. Farm to plate, probably there was a transition where Noma became the best restaurant in the world a few years ago in Copenhagen and Denmark, and they were really telling about their farmers. And we were saying genomic gastronomy takes us a step further, or at least furthers this cause in a certain way. So molecular gastronomy, the kitchen works with food processors in some way to make weird ingredients like meat glue or binders so they can do unusual sculptural things with food. And so there's sort of a conversation between eaters, the kitchen, and processors. You know, farm to plate says, well, we actually should go much further back and look at how the food is grown and tell the farmers or have a conversation with them about what we want out of food. And we're saying, no, we need to go much further back than that. We need to talk to the breeders and talk about the seeds and breeds that are selected for, and what are the biodiversity implications for before stuff is even grown, how it is selected. So that's kind of where we are thinking about our work and where genomic gastronomy may go further than a lot of restaurants are comfortable with, although we'd love to be invited to any high-end restaurants for free dinners. So if you know any chefs, we will take their tickets. And it has a bit to do with health. You know, I think that a lot of molecular gastronomy may focus on things like performance-enhancing drinks for people who are working out or exercising. It's largely chemical. Farm to plate starting to think more about environmental health. How do we actually look at the way our food is grown and the implications that has for soil, water, and like sort of the local region. And I think we're really thinking more about planetary health, right? We're scaling up, and how are we as eaters, how are we as a human civilization eating our way across the planet, defecating behind us and not cleaning up our shit, right? That's where we're at right now. We need to do a better job. So we're interested in planetary health. So the first buzzword you can tweet out if you so choose is Gaian gastronomy. This hasn't caught on yet, but I'll keep pushing it. So this is the idea, right, that actually maybe the planet is a superorganism that's somehow self-regulating, and we eat our way through it, like weird stuff on its skin. Eaters are agents of selection. This just means that there's selection pressures on the environment that humans induce by choosing what they eat. So if we eat more X versus Y, then the next year more X will be planted. And then planetary sculpture. And I think this is the one that makes our like activist foodie friends most uncomfortable. But we are sculpting the planet. We live in the Anthropocene, and we either need to stop doing that or we need to get good at it. But right now we're just making really ugly sculptures on the planet, and it's not going so well. So let's get good at that. So we have this thing called the Planetary Sculpture Supper Club, and this is a way to get people tasting things in a really specific way and to pay attention to food. So we make really unusual food that tells the story of how planetary patterns are changing based on how we eat. We got to do a pop-up version of this in Portugal, in Lisbon, for 3 months at an old palace, and the Pombal Palace, and the rooftop has the 4 seasons, and the rest of the room was kind of bare and not fixed well. So we made this huge reflective surface table, but we also made it so people weren't allowed to use cutlery and they had to eat with their hands, which was kind of fun because, to be fair, this was an art festival thing, and it was for sort of mostly rich and privileged people, so we at least wanted to have some fun doing it. One of the things that we did is we thought of this idea of a built-in biosensor. So one of the dishes we served was pig's tails. And the idea being that a lot of pigs that are raised industrially, they cut the tails off, right? Because they're bored and they'll bite at each other's tails and they'll get infected. So industrial farms will often just cut the tails off. So if you have a pig where you can source the tail, it's in some way a sense, it's built in telling you that it was raised in a certain way. So that's one of the dishes you saw on the plate. We're always coming back to technology, and particularly digital technology or IT, either to incorporate it or critique it. And we saw this kind of fun movement in Portland, Oregon, in the US when we were living there, where people were posting where you could harvest different food in the cities, particularly fruits. And so we started to have this fantasy where we, in the future, will grow these food forests, these urban orchards, and you'll just have your communication device and whatever you want, you just walk into different parts of the city and you taste it, right? And you can imagine the drifts and the walks that'll happen as you kind of eat your different courses. So we started thinking of this sort of cyber agrarian utopia that we wanted to build out, and one of the transitions, I think we have a huge break that's happening in our work right now, is away from these quick things we can do in the kitchen to more longer-term things like growing fruit trees, which is not even a one-season endeavor, right? So there's a certain amount of, we have to be in a place. So after 5 years of traveling and living on the road, we finally have a home, and hopefully we can grow some fruit trees. But that is one of the challenges, I think, of the hacker lifestyle, is that at some point, if you want to start to engage with ecosystems, you can't be in a place for 2 days or 2 weeks. You need a longer commitment to a landscape. And that's one of the things we're thinking about now. So yeah, food forest fantasies have been coming up in our dreams, and we started realizing that there's, in terms of the history of art, there's amazing art that starts to play out these other ways that forests or landscape could happen ecologically and culturally. But there wasn't a lot of good speculative agriculture. So you see lots of speculative cities. You see these sort of visions of future cities from the 60s and 70s in particular, but agricultures are sort of less articulated. So that's also something we're starting to think about more, is how to create at least images and prototypes of these speculative agricultures. Why don't I pause there for questions, because then you can wake up. It's so hot and you're going to get sleepy. So are there any questions so far? It's so unfair that there's water up here. You should go get some if you want some. Yeah.
Very humorous, and also maybe only on the second view deeply critical. How you deal with that? Isn't your work sometimes misinterpreted? It's just like some fancy food and, you know, general ideas about food for everyone in city.
I would ask you the same question. I mean, I was actually just noticing on Ur's slides and your own slides, like the little 8-bit man and the Japanese ninjas, there's a certain iconography that's used. It's very playful. You know, it's true. It's a real concern, and it's sort of, I think, just to keep doing it, to know your audience is important. So we just did an artwork that was nominally for the general public, but it was actually for the scientists we were working with. They didn't know that. So we did 3 days of tours, and the first day was for scientists, and the next 2 days was for the general public. The general public didn't come because it was in the middle of nowhere. But we got 40 microbiologists to go on this weird walking tour of their own lab with us. And so I think, you know, being aware of who your audience is, and when it comes to food, we don't value food and it's expensive. And so sometimes that means certain institutions only want people that can afford it. We work really hard to make sure that most of our events that are food heavy are accessible to all kinds of people. But yeah, it's, you know, food's expensive for sure. I haven't really answered your question, but it's an ongoing thing that I'm really interested in. And I like the fact that you have to spend more time with the finished work. When we're debating here, we're doing workshops, we can just, you know, argue with each other, have great conversations. But I think work that has meaning can often require a second look. So I'm okay with that. But if you have any specific misinterpretations of projects you've heard, I would love to know them, because it's always a good learning for us. Like, what are the different ways? And one thing I would distinguish our work from, like, let's say the work of a lot of design fiction, which is something that my partner sort of studied in grad school, is that we definitely don't try to intentionally fool our audience or fool the media. I mean, we're really keen on revealing some of the mechanisms at play, but hopefully doing it in a beautiful and playful way. So that would distinguish us from, like, people who are explicitly making hoaxes in order to, let's say, have a conversation in the media.
Actually, thinking about the critical aspect of your work, because I see it very quickly, very clearly, not in a second layer, but I think it's really central that you are criticizing power relations and so on. I'm just curious of how do you get your funding to be able to do all these amazing projects? And also, I think it's really interesting, this idea of a a certain contradiction between having a lifestyle of moving around a lot and having all this circulation of people and ideas, but also needing to have some kind of a rootedness to all these ideas that you are like interested in spreading around. So how do you manage that?
Yeah, let's do the second one first. It's a big question. Being an artist, a hacker, a maker, an outsider has always been hard or challenging, not hard, but and I think after the austerity measures in Europe, it's harder than ever. And the neoliberal sort of paradigm means that a lot of work has to couch itself in terms of innovation or STEM to STEAM or this kind of stuff. And so I think people are, including ourselves, are kind of smart about surviving while challenging from the inside the system we live in, but understanding where it's at. So that's, to a certain extent, we've been lucky that all three of us have an interest, let's say, in technology and science just before any of us met, and that fits into the current paradigm. And it may not, whatever paradigm happens after this. But most of our funding comes from like EU grants, from we teach, kind of the usual hobbling together, and we're pretty broke. And the same thing, what you were saying about having to move around all the time, that's how we survived. For 5 years, we didn't have a home. We went from residency to residency to grant, and that allowed us to do the work we wanted to, but there was also this frustration of not having a deep connection to a place and an ecosystem. And that's something we're contending with in our work right now. So it's an open question, but I'm happy to report that we have a home. We live in Dublin, and we're growing things on our roof. And just when I left, the blueberries were starting to fruit, so that was awesome. Probably the birds will eat them all up by the time I get home. What was the first question? Oh, how we're funded. Yeah, we just cobble stuff together and we're pretty much broke. So if you know of any rich people that want to throw a bunch of money our way, we will take it. Should we keep going and then we'll do some more questions? Yeah, okay. So why food freaking? We use this term food freaking. What is food freaking? Food freaking is a book that I will leave 3 copies for Interactivos. I'll leave 3 copies for the library at Media Lab Prado, and then there's more floating around. This publication we started a couple of years ago that was about the explorations, experiments, and exploits in human food systems. We chose the term food freaking specifically because as we were going to different hacker conferences and maker spaces, we were seeing this concept of food hacking, which was often about 3D printing mashed potatoes or 3D printing chocolate. It turns out mashed potatoes go really well apparently through them. Or making, sort of homemade kitchen hardware, like sous vide machines, and that's all really cool work. But I think we were very much more interested in a systems perspective, and as we looked back at the history of sort of hacking, phone freaking was a much more logical connection because these were people who explored an entire system, right? They called around and were trying to find different ways in. And also the most important part is it really dealt with infrastructure in a way that was important to us. So you can do sort of hack together a little piece of hardware in a little lab and it doesn't necessarily have to go anywhere. But phone freaking implied that you were calling someone and you were navigating infrastructure and a system. And food freaking, similarly, I think really requires us to look outside of just this space and take into account the infrastructure of agriculture and plant breeders, et cetera. So that's kind of why we chose the name. That was a bit technical, but I thought some of the geeks would be interested why we did that. So this is a publication that we started, and there's 3 issues out, and the 4th one is 90% done. In the issue number 0, we said food freaking is where food, technology, and open culture meets. What am I showing you? Pictures. Where's the graph? Yeah, so when we showed the first thing at the Chaos Communication Congress in Berlin, we said, listen, here's why you should care about food. One of the things we said, freedom of information should apply to agronomy, agriculture, genetics, and cuisine. It can't just be IT. And humans are reprogramming the biosphere every day. We're leaving most of those decisions to a few large companies. And there's a massive loss of genetic diversity, even in agriculture, and a privatization of the commons. So all the fights and battles that politicized hackers, particularly in Europe, because the US tends to be slightly less politicized, we're fighting with computers and other forms of information and communication technology were happening in agriculture, and it seemed like that bridge had to be built. I don't know that we've built it or anyone else has. It's still there to be done, but it seems pretty key. One of the things we've done in just keeping the open source conversation alive and building on others' work is all of the books are collages that we pull from the commons, so either Wikimedia Commons or other Creative Commons images. And it's fun because collage is so easy in the age of Photoshop, so limiting your palette to a smaller library actually makes for more creative images, which is nice. And then, we try to do all the images credits like as sort of precisely as possible. This question came up during Ur's talk, like how do you feel when someone else takes your stuff? And I feel like if what you're doing is borrowing and building and plundering, if you can at least give credit where possible, it just makes the conversation better. So yeah, if you look at the books, you can take a look at whose visual work we've built on previously. And it ends with, we have always been biohackers. And I just want to reiterate, I understand that this is a highly politicized statement. For example, someone who is a certain kind of GMO advocate, even for like, oh, Monsanto's the best company ever, of course we should have Roundup-ready corn because we've always been biohackers, right? That could be a way that that term is used, so it's not perfect. But I think that if it's one political strategy for saying, okay, actually when we have these conversations about biosafety or about food and agriculture, we need cheesemakers and winemakers at the table, and it can't just be bioinformaticians. Oh God, is that what they're called? Yeah. It has to have a larger conversation and take into account the rich history that we've built on. And similarly, taste matters. So when we did our very first research project in Bangalore, India, we were looking at, there was an attempt to introduce a genetically modified aubergine. It's called brinjal there in India, or eggplant in the US. And so this was an amazing image. So I took this at one of the protests. And you can see the wide range of colors, shapes, and sizes of brinjal, I think you can, on the table at the protest. And that was a really interesting way of protesting indirectly. It wasn't saying we don't want GMO, it was saying we want diversity. Sort of fascinating. These are some of the signs and symbols. So we got, as a class, I was working on this with a class of students, we got inspired by this sort of gesture we saw, and we realized we had a really stupid question. What does BT brinjal taste like? What does GMO, genetically modified aubergine, taste like? And no one had asked this question that we could find in the English-speaking press. We did a quick survey of Hindi language press. We didn't get to look at other Indian languages. But no one had asked the question, what does it taste like? And that seems really stupid until you start to think, well, is it going to be this big one or the small one? Oh, that is so dark. Oh. Anyways, there's a bunch of bright aubergines up there. They're like green and white. Each of the different varieties has a different recipe. And so if you have a massive reduction in biodiversity, you also have a massive reduction in recipes and flavors and tastes. Because, you can think about that big one you're going to roast, basically, and get all the meat out. You wouldn't take a small aubergine and roast it because you'd have nothing left. So there actually, morphology implies different recipes. So we started collecting the aubergines in the markets, collecting their local names, Kannada names, their Hindi names, just kind of seeing what was available in our own little city, in our own markets. And these were just the ones we found in Bangalore. It's a massive amount of biodiversity of brinjal. And so we did this project called BT, Brinjal Taste Test. And we realized there was a biodiversity of the kitchen, that actually you could have food security through obscurity, in the sense that if you got really obscure brinjals and people said, oh, I want to eat a dish my grandmother made, it requires me to have this light pink spiky brinjal that has to be grown in order for me to taste this, you could actually protect, you could have food security by making really obscure ingredients and recipes. And we're also thinking about culinary preservation. And might you see a movement where the United Nations would designate different genetic varieties as being worth preserving? So, and it's already happening with like PDO laws in Europe and other things. Okay, so that was the research. Based on this, we asked the question, what does a GMO taste like? I want to eat it. I applied to Interactivos, went to Gijón, and asked that question, and this project was born. Okay, let me bring it back to hackers and makers and techies for a second. Have people heard of Soylent? Oh, not that many. Okay, great. That's good. Has anyone tasted Soylent? All right. We've been doing Soylent taste tests for the last 3 months, serving Soylent, Joylent, Manna, different varieties. Basically, it's this ready-to-eat meal that you pour water, and this guy, I forget his name, has this obsession idea that we just waste too much time eating. If we could only just drink all of our meals, we could get back to coding or doing our law work and putting in 60 hours. And I do think there's some interesting parts of Soylent for sure, and there's people who really love it and the community built around it. But to me, it also strikes me as like the last part of austerity. You don't even have time to enjoy your 10-minute lunch, down this drink, right? People probably disagree, there's other ways of seeing it for sure, but one of the things it is about is maximizing fungibility. What I mean by that is the ingredients are things like soy and lentils that can be grown anywhere and be thrown into this mix and you don't know what they are. So this abstracts food to the maximum amount, and I think that's actually quite dangerous because it's a bit like this open source thing. If we don't know what's in it and anything can kind of go in it in different mixes, it's very hard to slow it down. It can move very fast across the globe. So we did the Soylent Banquet recently in Dusseldorf, where we did a cooking demonstration where everyone helped us cook with all of the raw ingredients of Soylent as slow as possible. One of the things that was really fun, there's a guy there, and they're making all these weird techie food dishes, and he goes, "Oh, I really love this. This is like in the olden days where we would all get together and cook." And so it was really ironic that it took us making fun of Soylent to get everyone around the table to cook together. So thank you, Soylent, for that. That was great. These were some of the raw ingredients, and we kind of thought about different ways to process them. And unlike what we usually do, which is to draw from a wide variety of culinary traditions, for this one we went for like super high tech. So we tried to get as many weird and wonderful like smoking guns and spun sugar and these kinds of things, and so served them on petri dishes. And so these were the final dishes. And I see this practice as analogous to a lot of the practice that people are doing here over the next few weeks, and that in particular Or's presented. I think I don't have the technical skills to do this other stuff with biology, but there's a lot of bigger stories to tell about biology that are not purely technical, and so I think this is where I can contribute to that conversation. I'm a pretty good home cook. When we do really big dinners, we do work with chefs, because we don't want to serve like 100 people my food. But 20 people I can cover. And basically we had one question, which was kind of childish. What happens if I put this in my mouth? And so after we started building on our work in 2010 of what happens if I eat a GMO, there was other things that came up that we might not think of as ingredients, but that are accidental ingredients. And for example, people know the BioSteel goat story? Oh, these are all American references, I'm so sorry. There was this weird military program where they genetically modified a goat and put in a gene that for spider silk so they can milk the goat and then weave the spider silk into body armor. True story. So if you took that goat milk and made cheese out of it, what would it taste like? Would those spider silk threads cut your throat? Would it be deliciously, protein rich? So we just started looking around for weird stuff that we get our hands on and cook with. We haven't yet gotten any BioSteel goat milk, so if you know any hookups. There's still a few goats alive in Canada, apparently, but we haven't got any milk smuggled out. So one of the unexpected ingredients that came up early on was smog, and we realized that smog, air pollution, was an ingredient that was always present, and depending on where you were, it changed how you perceived and tasted the world. So if you think about when you're at different elevations, you have to cook differently. Right? You have different cooking times. It's like that, but everywhere it actually changes how you taste. So back in 2012, we did a project with students at Srishti in Bangalore. This is Bangalore recently. This is, it looks really fun and cool. It's not a soap party. It's toxic bubbles from one of the waterways where effluents have been dumped in. So it's a pretty rough situation in Bangalore in terms of ambient air and water pollution. And so we started asking our students, what do you want to do a project on? They want to do something with air pollution. But what we didn't want to do, and this is where we differ than sort of just hardcore techies, was we didn't want to just arbitrarily build an environmental monitor. Because we could take an environmental air quality monitor, hack it together, put it out in the street, and there's some learnings there, but who sees those numbers? How do we actually take those numbers of data readings and make them have some affect? So as we were doing this class, we read this one passage from a cooking book called On Food and Cooking by Harold McGee that said, thanks to eggs, we are able to harvest the air. And that term, harvest the air, really caught my attention. And this is why it's important that even technical writers have some poetry in their life, because you never know who's going to read it and take that and do something with it. And so we were like, yeah, we need to harvest air pollution and taste it, and we need to get people to see what it tastes like. So we went around the city and we collected air pollution from different sites. And we cooked those meringues, and we served them, and the initial meringues were literally about getting people to have a subjective response. So no one wanted that meringue in the middle, because it's from Makery Circle, which is part of Bangalore, which if you've ever been there, it's where all the cars and buses meet. So people were like, yeah, I'm not going to eat that. And so we were like, okay, actually there's something to this little prototype we made. There's some affect that we've put into this tasting of air quality. Also, just in terms of keeping things open source or open, we were like happy for anyone to build on this research, and it was quiet for a couple of years, and then just recently this journalist from South America wrote in, oh, actually Central America, ooh, and said, hey, can I do smog tasting and write about it? And we're like, yeah, definitely. So these are some nice faces of people eating smog. So, you know, I think that there's probably a good conversation to be had about how much technical things need to be and how much cultural it is, and where those can go back and forth, because this is largely cultural and not particularly technical. But of course we made it technical. And so we were so sad of having to like whip up meringues only in one city. We wanted to compare Beijing to New Delhi, to Lisbon, to Madrid. So we found out that there is a smog machine that they use in California at the University of California lab to make different smogs. And Nicola Twilly, our collaborator, contacted them, and they were like, yeah, sure, we'll give you all the plans, and you can make your own smog machine. This is where the chemicals go in. So they gave us the plans, and this was our first smog synthesizer. This allows us to actually make smog from different cities by pumping in different constituent chemicals in different amounts. So these are some of the chemicals we put in are we get like nitric acid and we drop in a penny to make NOx, and we use these orange peels and these pine leaves to make terpenes, because like a lot of smogs like in Atlanta, Georgia in the US, actually the pine trees contribute a lot to the formation of smog. That brown you see is the smog starting to form in the chamber. So we pump all the chemicals in, and then we whip up eggs. And then we serve people them. And the very first group of people we served, this is your humor part. I hope you find this funny. The very first people we served smogs to were all of the heads of the health ministers that came to the World Health Organization last year in Geneva. So we had all these smogs set out. The first guy walked in. He ate one without asking us what it was. Anyone have a guess what country it was? Who just comes in and just stuffs stuff in their face? I was hoping now. It was Australia. The Australian guy just like ate smog, so that was kind of interesting. And so, you know, I hope there was an irony that was quite visible to what was happening, that we collected, that all of these health ministers were coming from around the world, and they were being fed smog, in often cases from their home places. Here we are in Geneva, talking to some of these folks. But we've also want to bring this to the streets, and it's really important to us when we can to be situated in the real world, not in some, like, you know, art museum, art gallery. So here we are in the Bowery between a guy serving sandwiches and a guy serving juice. And, you know, each of those are like $6 and $8. And then people come to us like, how much does it cost? Oh, it's free. What is it? It's smog. Ugh, I'm not going to eat that. It's going to kill me. We're like, well, you're in the Bowery in New York. What do you think you're breathing right now? And they're like, oh, yeah. And so, you know, this thing happens where they get it, and that becomes really powerful. And people have these different experiences. One of my favorite ones was someone came and like they had a sore throat after they ate a bunch of these. And they said, I don't understand, I have a sore throat. We're like, yeah, you just ate smog. And she goes, oh, I thought you were abstract artists. I said, no, we're realists. She said, oh, okay. All right, so, you know, good. You got some art historians. So we're starting to think more and more about the ways that recipes or ambient environmental conditions cook the eater and not just the food. And might we write recipes to manipulate those environmental conditions? And here's Bangalore. Oh, you can't see it so great in this photo, but there's the smog catcher and there's the smog contributor in the background, or one of them. So yeah, accidental ingredients, eating in the Anthropocene. I have one last section, but should we stop again, or do you want me to keep rolling? Just keep going? All right, you're too sleepy to even pretend to. So weird eaters. We have less and less farmers and more humans. It's a strange condition, but as the population has exploded and continues to explode, we don't think farmers are necessarily going to do that, which means that a lot of the decisions being made about what gets put in the ground happens upstream or downstream away from farmers by other forces, and eaters are one of those forces. We're not like fully responsible, but we can help. So we don't use the word natural, as I said before, but we do say eaters are agents of selection. Based on the preference and desires, we want carrots that are more sweet. Well, it turns out when you select for sweetness in carrots, it tends to get rid of some of the bitter and change the colors. And so you have this weird political story of carrots being orange because of the Netherlands, but also because genetically, as you breed for sweetness, they become orange. But of course, we have this wide diversity, and so you see that food, even the color it is, has the stamps of human desires built into it. I'll skip all this stuff. Let me just get to the work. So this, someone asked about how we get paid. So we were like, oh God, we're artists. We should sell stuff, right? Because you have to be part of the art market. So why don't we have a limited edition barbecue sauce? Because we could totally make an edition of 50 and sell these. We haven't sold any yet, but it's only been 3 years, so who knows? And that's kind of a joke, sorry. But it also was thinking about how do we make some of this work last beyond just the meal, because it does break down, it does rot. So a sauce that's bottled gives us a little bit more longevity, and we could share some of ideas across a larger geography. So this barbecue sauce is made from mutation-bred plants. So after World War II, most countries developed mutation breeding programs or other programs where they use this new fangled technology that everyone was excited about. And some of the people were excited. There was these people reading poems about atomic peanuts in England, for example. And then other people were horrified. They just said, we dropped a nuclear weapon. We can't do anything positive with this technology. And so there was a lot of hype and hope and hysteria about this technology of mutation-bred plants. And let's see if I have a picture. I don't. So basically, there's lots of ways that scientists manipulated these plants, but for example, you could take the bud sticks, the small twigs of a grapefruit tree, expose them to cobalt-60, and then graft them on. In one case, they had these gamma gardens, which were these circular gardens where they grew plants in a circle around a radioactive source that was in the ground. They lifted that source up and exposed them to radiation. And then this is before genetic sequencing, so scientists would just go around these gardens and be like, yeah, that one looks bigger, let's grow that one, right? So they were phenotypical selections that were made. So we did some research in the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency's database, and this is the geeky part, there's a really good record of all of the plants that we think that have been mutation bred, because it turns out if you're playing with radioactive material, you have to keep good records, unless you're Israel and Iran. I think those are the two ones that have fuzzy records in there. But, so some of the ingredients that we found were Milne's Golden Promise barley, Rio Red grapefruit, blah, blah, blah. And we went to this organic bodega in Portland, Oregon. We bought three grapefruits. And this is not staged. This is why you have to get out into the world. We're just like, let's just buy 3 grapefruits, and we're going to look these up in the database. And 2 out of 3 of these were mutation-bred varieties. And I'm sure if we told the people that shopped at their store there, they would be horrified. Until we explained that maybe it's not so bad. You've been eating them for 40 years. It's probably fine, we think. No one really knows. So we threw a big party, a barbecue, where we served this barbecue sauce, and we got our friends to come out, and we had this debate. When we sent this sauce to a museum in California, the head curator wrote to us and freaked out and said, you're sending radioactive material through the mail, how can you do this? We said, no, it's not radioactive, it's just radiation bred. So all that means is these plants have been mutated in a fashion similar to how random mutations happen from the sun. The only difference is that maybe there's multiple point mutations in a single generation, and that humans have selected and grown for them, so even if they have mutations that would not be beneficial in another setting, but it's, there's similar. So she got over it, and that becomes then the point of conversation, right? Like, are these different than other ways that we've manipulated organisms, whether that be selective breeding through seed saving, or through transgenesis, or other techniques that are being developed, Cas9, or other lab techniques. So yeah, you can taste this sauce. We do make new versions of it and batches of it for different shows. We give you a bit of the history of mutation breeding. And I have 2 last projects, and then we'll be done. So the very first project after Interactivos that we did was the Glowing Sushi Cooking Show. There was a lot of debates in the US press about whether we should have genetically modified salmon, fish, which I think were just recently approved by the Obama administration for consumption, but they can't be grown in the US, so they're going to be grown in Chile. At that time, there was all this press saying, oh, these will be the first, GMO salmons will be the first genetically modified animal or fish to be eaten. And we thought, well, that's not true. We know we can buy these transgenic zebrafish, so we're going to make a cooking show about them. So we did that, and this is, this artist Adam Zaretsky, sort of pointed me to this Foursquare, and people feel really comfortable when you cross these lines. We don't eat our pets. We tend not to let lab animals out into the wilds. So, these are sold in pet stores, but they're fish. They have lots of uses in the world, or they do lots of things in the world. So why not eat them? So this is our glowing sushi roll. This is the Not in California roll, because it's based on the California roll sushi, and you can't buy these fish in the state of California. And we wanted to satirize this innovation paradigm. I think we all face this thing living in Europe or North America. Innovation, that's what artists can do. They can help make cool, weird stuff and not get paid, and then engineers could take that and make products out of it. And so we did just that. We went up the stream and we contacted the company that sells these as pets, and we said, hey, we're serving these as food. Can we get a massive discount if we buy big loads of them? And we had about 2 or 3 emails back, and they didn't like it so much. We actually met the original inventor of these fish in Singapore a couple years ago and shared our idea with him. And he wasn't horrified, but more of just like, why would you do that? And we said, well, what did you want to invent these fish for? He said, I wanted them to be environmental pollution sensors, so that when they were in waterways, they would fluoresce when there's pollution. But it never worked, so I just sold the IP to a Texas guy. So we're like, okay, man, well, you know. So these fish weren't supposed to glow, they weren't supposed to do these things, and they weren't supposed to be eaten. And that's kind of the small gesture that we did. So this is our stop and glow roll. This is my favorite project because people are really spending a lot of time debating it, not only on YouTube, but on really interesting technical forums like home fish forums, different fisheries and science forums. And I think it's weird enough that it makes people not use their normal rhetoric. You have pro-GMO partisans who are like, this is dumb. If this is how people are going to use GMOs, maybe we shouldn't let them out into the world. And it's like, yeah, people are going to do unexpected things with technology. That's how the world works. There's also people who are like, I hate GMOs, but I would love glowing food. And I think that there was a question about how the work is interpreted. I think this is successful because it is just strange enough that people really have to work hard at it to get something out of it. I'm going to skip through these. And I just want to show you the last 2 things we're working on. We're thinking more and more about databases and what goes into them and what doesn't. And so we made a spice mix supercomputer. I'll just show you the pictures because it's pretty much, you can probably get what's happening. There's a smell synthesizer. Basically, there was air being forced through a patch-based synthesizer, and the spices were in the helmet, and you could sort of play them. The first one was monophonic, but then we got a polyphonic one. And once you got a spice smell you like, you would go to the back, and you would put a punch card in this machine, and then it would mix your spices, and you would see this, like the apparatus working. It was actually Kat in the back. She doesn't like talking to the public that much, so she spent the whole summer just hiding and mixing spices, which was a good job for her, and I talked to people all over Northern England. That was fun, and we did make our first artistic participant throw up because they put their head in and they were really hungover. Luckily, they didn't throw up on the artwork, but it was a moment of pride. Yeah, so beta tasters. Then we did this again recently at Kew Gardens in London. This time we did have a real computer and not someone in the back room mechanical turking it. And basically people could come in, make some selections. And this is the least political thing we've ever done. But in its way, where it was cited in England, what it did show was the travel of organisms and ingredients around the world, but also the strong barriers and things that are never crossed and should be crossed. And so, for example, this little kid made the best spice mix, new spice mix we've come across, which she put together bay leaves, kaffir lime leaves, sumac, and juniper berries. And both for ecological and cultural reasons, those 4 things don't come together. So that was kind of fun to just have people play with these ingredients, and we got about 1/3 of the way through programming every spice mix possible within our database over 4 months at Kew Gardens. And then just a technical note, we tried really hard to make this crazy apparatus with like glass tubes and tinctures after this first version, which was a bit like simple. And it turned out that actually the best thing was the low-tech version. So in that circle, there's an array of 25 computer fans that turn on and off, and behind each computer fan is just the raw spice on a shelf. And every 3 days, someone would step behind the wall and replace the spices. And that was a much more elegant solution than all the crazy technical ones that we were trying to devise. So sometimes low-tech is great. We're doing another sort of similar thing now with ordering recipes based not on ingredients, but based on different adjectives about what you want the future to taste like. So this is up here for another week in Dublin. And then this is the last thing I wanted to show you. We just finished the tour with the scientists I was telling you about, looking at the microbiome. And our audience, even though they didn't know it, was the scientists at this research lab, and we gave them a tour of their research lab in 20 years. And it was fascinating. I love scientists. Like, any messed up thing we could tell them did not faze them. We're like, this is the dump truck. It's a fecal transplant cart for people who want to do cosmetic fecal transplants to make their insides look as beautiful as their outsides. And they're like, oh yeah, I can see that becoming really popular. And I mean, they challenged us on some technical things, but this was a good opportunity to get inside a really important research lab that's looking at the human microbiome and start to understand what their limits are for their own research. And at least 4 of them said it actually changed how they were going to do their research, which was amazing. Like, that was super wonderful. So I will end there. Yeah, thanks.